Theoretically, the Senate might discuss and decide only such issues as were presented to it by a magistrate, and its decisions were merely advice, senatus consulta, without the force of law. Actually, its prestige was so great that the magistrates nearly always accepted its recommendations. A quote by Will Durant from his book, Caesar and Christ. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 9th episode in the Roman Empire series. This episode will go over some heroes and stories from the era of the very early Republic in Rome in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ. Now, the chronology of the entire period of the Roman Republic is frequently divided into 3 eras or stages. There is the early Republic, which essentially includes the centuries between the fall of the last king in Rome and the beginning of the Punic Wars in 264 BC. This early Republican era includes the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. The term Middle Republic is usually used to describe the time of the Punic Wars between 264 BC and 146 BC. By the end of the Third Punic War in 146, Rome had eliminated most of her significant geopolitical enemies in the Mediterranean. The Late Republic then covers that period between this pinnacle of power at the end of the last Punic War and the rise of the first Emperor Augustus in 27 BC. The Late Republic is characterized by infighting, corruption, and a slow movement away from the oligarchic democracy of the past and the autocracy of the coming empire. This episode, though, will look at the early Republic, or at least what little we know about it. As I've previously stated, the city of Rome was sacked and burned in 390 BC by the Gauls, so good records of what happened before then were mostly lost. Consequently, it seems possible that these stories about the early Republic are somewhat legendary, possibly even fictitious. Nevertheless, we will look at stories about 3 heroes from this period because even if they are embellished or even fabricated, they are the stories as told by later Romans. And so we gain a good idea, at least, of what later Romans cherished about their history and about their culture. Furthermore, this early period gives us a good look at something known to Roman history as the conflict of the orders. In the last episode, I had already alluded to this phenomenon, the class struggle between patricians and plebs. During this period, the era prior to the Punic Wars, we see the conflict between these strata of society continuing to heat up, resulting in ongoing changes in the structure of Roman society and its government. Now, if you would like to support the structure of this podcast, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment wherever you listen to it. The Western Traditions Podcast is found on Amazon Music, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, and other platforms. On my website, western-traditions.org, you can visit the shopping page to buy Western Traditions merchandise, or you can support the podcast directly through donations with the PayPal or Patreon buttons. Patreon supporters get personal updates about the podcast, and I also share links and essays about historical topics on the Patreon page. Let us begin with Coriolanus. His account is possibly the most legendary, and the modern consensus is that he did not even really exist. However, Plutarch, who is not afraid to describe certain characters in his essays as somewhat legendary, appears to take it for granted that the man was a real general of the Roman Republic. According then to what ancients such as Plutarch and Livy have passed down to us, Coriolanus was a real man, son of a patrician family who led Roman forces in battle and exemplified certain cherished aspects of Roman conduct. His praenomen, or the first of his 3 names in the Roman nomenclature called Trianomina, is uncertain. It may have been Caius with a C, or Gaius with a G, or even Gnaeus, Gnaeus, but regardless, he was a son of the house of Marcius, so his nomen or middle name was Marcius, though perhaps I should pronounce that as Marcius in classical Latin. And finally, he became known in life as Coriolanus, which became his cognomen, due to a certain battle that I will get to here in a moment. Coriolanus would have been born, if he was truly born, sometime in the late 6th century, coming to manhood in the early 5th century. Therefore, he was born during the monarchy and was a young defender of the equally young republic. Plutarch reports that Coriolanus was raised by a single mother, who was a widow to some Roman man of the house of Marcius. Plutarch quickly tells us that Coriolanus was remembered and hailed for his great deeds in life, but that the glory of his remembrance was tempered by, quote, the vehemence of his passion, unquote, and his, quote, obstinate reluctance to yield or accommodate, unquote. And this just reinforces the idea that the Romans were less willing than the Greeks to forgive bad conduct in their heroes. Achilles could pout on the beach all he wanted, and Odysseus could get himself tangled in any number of situations complicated by awkward moral choices, because these men ultimately accomplished great deeds. The Greeks forgave them their errors, indulged them, because they atoned for their misdeeds and their omissions with their heroism. Roman heroes, though, must demonstrate dignity and humility as well as bravery and ingenuity. For more evidence of this, just revisit the Aeneid, and there in the portrayal of Aeneas, you have the perfect Roman man. Brave and strong, yes, but more importantly, dutiful, pious, dignified. Perhaps the defects in Coriolanus' character derived from the very circumstances in which his superior qualities originated. Disadvantaged by his lack of a father growing up, Coriolanus threw himself into manhood, as if he had something to prove. As Plutarch tells us, he inured his body to all sorts of activity and endurance. He learned to handle weapons and armor as a very young boy, outran his opponents in all the races, outwrestled them in all the fights, and was known to be tireless and brave, almost foolhardy from the very start of his manhood. Now, when Coriolanus was a young man, the exiled King Tarquin was still organizing resistance against this new republic, and many of the realms surrounding Rome allied with this king, all of them eager to take a local enemy down a notch, even if it would just aid a foreign king to retake his throne. And Rome's danger cannot be understated here. At this point, the Romans controlled just 300 or 400 square miles of territory in west-central Italy. That may sound like a lot, but it's less than the metropolitan area of many modern major cities. In fact, they probably only controlled a territory the size of the actual city of Rome today. And this included all of their farmland as well as all of their urban and suburban homes and businesses. Even with Iron Age arms and technology, it would not take much more than one major battlefield loss to overrun such a tiny republic. So when young Coriolanus displayed unusual bravery in a battle versus these enemies, he was recognized and lauded by his superiors and crowned with a garland of oak leaves, as was and continued to be the custom in Rome for recognizing a man who had saved Roman lives. And Coriolanus, or Marcius as he still would have been known at this time, went on to achieve other victories and earn more trophies from the Romans, but most important of all to him, so the legend goes, was the joy of his own mother each time she saw him crowned with another reward for glory. Now, as with virtually all Roman stories from the Republican era, though, there's more to the plot of Coriolanus' legend than his heroic deeds. There is, as always, the class conflict. Get used to this in reading Roman history. It almost always comes back to the warfare between the commoners and the upper classes. It came about, when Coriolanus was already quite famous among the Romans, that the plebs began to agitate about their treatment, especially due to the moneylenders who preyed on them. It should be remembered that this legend dates back to a time just before the 12 Tables, about which I spoke in the last episode, and a portion of the 12 Tables was dedicated to controlling interest rates on loans. Indeed, the class struggle in the tale of Coriolanus may be a surviving tale of the conflicts which led to the resolution that was the 12 tables. Anyway, even men who had fought for Rome in its many battles were finding themselves turned out of house and home and turned into paupers, mainly due to moneylenders who seem to always be a pestilence in society, even today. There came a time then when the consuls called the men of Rome to assemble for yet again another military campaign against Rome's enemies, and the commoners simply did not show up, leaving the consuls standing there with virtually no source of soldiery. The upper classes could provide the cavalry, but they needed heavy infantry, light troops, and many other kinds of troops to fight a war effectively. In fact, at this time, the plebs did not just passively resist. When they saw that the Senate was not going to address their concerns, they seized control of a nearby hilltop and declared that they could go anywhere in Italy to breathe air, drink water, and die, which was all they could any longer afford to do in Rome anyway. Now, some of the more moderate men in the Senate desired to negotiate with the plebs over the matter. Not Coriolanus, though. He is not that kind of hero. Coriolanus was enraged with the insolence of these plebs and told the Senate that this would lead to full-scale revolt and that the resistance must be put down at once. Here, though, is what one of the senatorial negotiators had to say to the plebs on their hilltop redoubt. "It once happened," he said, "that all the other members of a man mutinied against the stomach, which they accused as the only idle, uncontributing part in the whole body, while the rest were put to hardships and the expense of much labor to supply and minister to the stomach's appetites. The stomach, however, merely ridiculed the silliness of the members, who appeared not to be aware that the stomach certainly does receive the general nourishment, but only to return it again and redistribute it among the rest. Such is the case, ye citizens, between you and the Senate. The counsels and the plans that are there duly digested convey and secure to all of you your proper benefit and support." And the plebs accepted this reasoning and opened negotiations which led to the Senate agreeing to the annual elections of 5 tribunes. This was, according to the legend, the origin of the tribunes, elected men who would work in the government to ensure that the consuls and the Senate did not mistreat the commoners. This office of tribune would continue to evolve over time, growing to include 6 and then even 14 total members at any time, with the significance of their power increasing or decreasing depending on a variety of circumstances. Now, Coriolanus, for his part, wanted to show that he and his class of Roman, the patrician class, were indeed superior to the rebellious commoners. So in the next military campaign against the nearby town of Corioli, he was not content to simply drive the enemy back into their city. Instead, he pushed on with a few rugged volunteers, daring to fight even under the city walls where the enemy could fire spears, darts, and arrows down on him. Eventually, he and his small band actually breached the gates and stormed the city, which was then sacked, and thus he gained his cognomen, Coriolanus, for his taking of the city of Corioli. Later, Coriolanus finally made his move, and he stood for election to the consulship. He had a sizable following among some of the younger sons of powerful men in Rome, but he was ultimately rejected for the position of consul, probably due to his violent antipathy for the masses. Afterward, when a large quantity of grain arrived in Rome from various parts, including a gift made to the Roman state by the people of Syracuse and Sicily, there was a political movement to disperse the grain equally among the people of Rome. Coriolanus, however, would hear nothing of the kind. He characterized this ancient communism as pandering to the masses, as something that the Greeks would do, because in Greece, as he said, quote, "the populace is supreme," unquote. When the tribunes, present in the hearing before the Senate, relayed this message to the plebs outside, there was a tumult. Only just barely did the tribunes and the senators keep the entire populace from overthrowing the state in that moment. A great and lengthy courtroom drama ensued, in which Coriolanus was initially made to appear before the people and explain himself and his remarks, but he spoke so unapologetically and so insultingly that the tribunes sentenced him to be thrown from the Tarpeian rock and thus fall to his death. But after much back and forth between the upper and lower classes and more proud words from Coriolanus, he was finally sentenced to mere banishment. So Coriolanus took up residence among the Volscians, against whom he had actually just recently led Roman troops on many occasions. Soon then, being as passionate in his vengeance as he had previously been in his loyalty to Rome, Coriolanus was leading Volscian troops against Rome. He laid waste to the countryside, seized many Roman colonies, and conquered many cities allied to Rome as well, according to the legend. Eventually, his army came to the very walls of Rome itself. The populace inside those walls, both the real quote-unquote people and the commoners alike, found themselves terrified. The Senate first sent politicians to try to sway Coriolanus. Then they sent priests. But all their appeals to brotherhood, to the gods, were to no avail. Finally, when it seemed certain that this former favored son of Rome would soon lead foreign troops over the walls and destroy the city, his mother and his wife and his children were sent to see him in his war camp. He could not resist his mother's pleas on behalf of Rome. He broke up his camp and returned the Volscian soldiers to their homes. In response to their salvation and to the role of women in it, the Romans built statues in a special temple dedicated to Lady Fortuna, Lady Fortune, about whom we will hear much more in later eras of Roman history. But Coriolanus himself was not fortunate. Upon returning to his new home among the Volscians, he was charged with treason for having let the Romans escape a certain defeat. The exiled Roman had both supporters and detractors among his newfound friends among the Volscians, but while they argued the merits of his case, conspirators attacked the man in a group, in much the same way perhaps that Julius Caesar was brought down, and they successfully assassinated him. In the immediate aftermath of this tragedy, the Volscians again went to war, this time with one of their own allies. The result, without Coriolanus, was the total defeat of their army, and the Volscians were so weakened by this loss that they soon became subject to Rome. Not long after these events, another figure of Roman history and legend comes to the forefront. In fact, he may have been a contemporary with Coriolanus, even if they were both essentially legendary. I speak now of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Maybe in classical Latin it would be Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, but he is remembered today simply as Cincinnatus. We learn of Cincinnatus through the Roman historian Livy rather than Plutarch. Cincinnatus provides us with perhaps the classic example of Roman patrician virtue. Coriolanus was a great man, but for the Romans he was too passionate and too ambitious. When we read the Greek histories, when we read about men like Alcibiades and Themistocles, they are at least tacitly admired for their wily ambition and their distrustfulness, but this trait was a sign of low character for the early Romans. Now, of course, famous Roman men of later ages like Marius and Sulla and Pompey and Caesar, they were obviously ambitious men. So with the story of Cincinnatus, I'm not trying to say that the Romans were universally stoic and unambitious and coldly dignified, etc., but rather simply that stories like this tell us something about the way that the Romans saw themselves, or what they wished to emulate, and what they told themselves was ideal. In the same way, in Christian societies, there are factions and ambition and revenge and lust and greed, but the people of those societies aspire to another model. In the same way, the Romans were as capable of base passions, but they looked to legends like that of Cincinnatus or even Aeneas for their inspiration. Cincinnatus provides us with a quick and classic example of the way that Romans thought political power should be handled. He came from a patrician family. Now, during the tumultuous years of the 5th century, when the Republic was struggling just to survive, it was not uncommon for the consuls to elect a dictator from among the patrician class. And I mentioned this government role on the last episode. A Roman dictator was elected to hold supreme power for 6 months, basically to streamline things during a military emergency when senatorial discussion would just take too long to meet a crisis. As the story goes, anyway, the Roman army, sometime in the mid-5th century BC, had become surrounded by the enemy at Mount Algidus in nearby Latium, and it was in danger of a complete massacre. Cincinnatus was appointed dictator to lead reinforcements to save this army. It took him just 16 days for him to be nominated, assemble his forces, march to the battlefield, defeat the enemy, save the army, and return to Rome. 16 days. And upon returning home, he immediately resigned the dictatorship. The story is made even more delightful by the following details. When the senatorial delegation went to inform him of his election as dictator, they found the man plowing his field. After accepting the appointment, he had to wipe the mud off and put on formal senatorial garb before rallying the remaining men of the city, many of them too young or too old to have ventured out with the first army. And after winning the battle with this army, which saved Rome and its main army, just 16 days later, Cincinnatus returned to Rome, resigned his post, and went back to plowing his field. The story presents ideal Roman virtues. Cincinnatus is brave, as any Roman man should be, but he's not vainglorious about it. He accepts the responsibility of power in the dictatorship, but does not use it to his own advantage. He does not, for example, try to extend his dictatorship even one moment longer than what was required to accomplish what he was sent to do. A weaker man, a less virtuous man — remember that virtue originally simply meant manliness for the Romans — a less virtuous man might have tried to use this power to enrich himself or his friends, dole out favors, etc. And then he returns to his humble work in plowing his fields where he grows some cabbages. However real or fictional this account may be, there's one important detail that we should notice, though. Cincinnatus was not a fan of the plebs. Virtuous as he may have been, he was not an egalitarian. The legend tells us of how he stood against all measures in the Senate that favored the plebs. The legend of Cincinnatus also tells us that, in fact, that his son was charged with actually murdering one of the plebeians, and that Cincinnatus had to sell much of his estate to pay the fine that was leveled against the family. He moved to a smaller farm farther away from the city after this, where he continued to plow the land and grow his cabbages. Now, today we see the wealthy as people far separated from the labor of their servants and the products which give them their wealth. And in times of war, the wealthy are the ones pulling the strings and reaping the benefits, while poor people go to die in battles which benefit only the arms makers and the oil barons and so on. When we look at someone like Cincinnatus, then, we might be inclined to see him as just another oppressor, one of the upper classes who used plebeians, the working class, to further his own gains. But the thing that seems to distinguish the upper classes of the past, compared to those that we have today, is that they had skin in the game. Cincinnatus may have been rich and domineering, but he was not afraid to share toil and share danger with the people that he led. And we see this also in the stories of the ancient Greeks as well. Odysseus finds his father, the former king, living simply in the countryside in a hut at the end of the Odyssey. And his wife, Penelope the queen, she spins her own wool. And Cincinnatus is muddy from working his fields alongside his servants and slaves. And when these famous wealthy men of the past declare war, they do not send others to do their dirty work. They share the danger and quite often suffer death in battle. In the Greek series, all the heroes and leaders were often at the forefront of battles, right down to Alexander the Great. This sharing in the troubles of life and in battle is a characteristic of the wealthy right up until the modern age, actually. Even as recently as the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, we see many generals on both sides of the conflict running great risks and dying in battle, not just sending others to die so that they might benefit. In World War II, it was still common for sons of the wealthy, like John F. Kennedy, to share the dangers of war with comrades from less advantaged backgrounds. And then something changed. The wealthy stopped sharing those dangers, stopped sharing, so to speak, skin in the game. They started to benefit enormously from the labor and suffering of others without sharing any of the risks and troubles. Discussion of that change, in which we see now that the ultra-wealthy are completely cocooned, completely preserved from the struggles of the common man, this will all appear in another series in this podcast. But so while we may scorn a man like Cincinnatus somewhat, and quite justifiably as an elitist, we should still admire and respect his bravery and his willingness to stand alongside plebeians and to share their work and their dangers on the battlefield, even if he stood to gain more from the risks taken. And understand that there is, unfortunately, more to this story than just that noble legend. This legend tells us that Cincinnatus resigned his dictatorial powers and humbly went back to farming cabbages, but in another account, told by the historian Dionysius, Cincinnatus used his position as a dictator to hold a trial and banish from Rome a plebeian who had merely displeased him. Power, the struggle for and against power, and corruption are ever themes in this Roman story. Ancient historians of Rome, such as Polybius, portray the ancient Roman Republic as the very model of order and stability. But Polybius, who was technically a diplomatic hostage during his time in Rome, was either very enamored of Roman society or who was trying to flatter his captors, or both. So in his writings, he gives us an idea of Rome which unfolds in as orderly a fashion as the universe does in the first chapter of Genesis, right? One logical step after the other. But reading the histories of Plutarch, one can become easily confused when trying to compare his descriptions of events and people with Polybius's and others' portrayals of Roman government. For example, I've told you about the supremacy of the Senate and their delegation of power to two consuls who were elected year by year. In times of great need, a dictator might be elected for 6 months or even less in the case of Cincinnatus. Yet when we come to the story of a man like Camillus, who reportedly saved Rome from being completely erased from history after it was sacked by the Gauls in 390 BC, it's hard to see this stratified scheme of government in place and working just as described. Camillus himself was never once a consul, but he was dictator several times. And the story of his life seems to portray the popularly elected tribunes as having more de facto power than the consuls and even the Senate itself. Perhaps we need to accept that for the Romans, time periods like the 5th and even the 4th century are still quote-unquote legendary or mythological times. Among the Greeks in the 5th century, we already have the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides giving us increasingly clearer, more coherent, and more reliable accounts of past events, even if they suffer from the expected human bias and lack of perspective at times. As I stated in the Greek series, we see in those documents a clear movement away from mythological writings, gods moving among men, fables of heroes, etc., and they move towards more realistic portrayals of events. Not so among the Romans, though. Perhaps this is all due to the loss of their earliest records when the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC. Regardless, the fact is that when we compare the writings and the accounts that we do have of Roman events and Roman government and Roman people during these centuries, we get a much more chaotic picture of just how Roman society was managed in its earliest days than we would if we just stuck with one historian. Were the consuls in charge, or the tribunes, or maybe the censors? Were they elected or appointed, and by whom? Just how involved was the Senate in day-to-day matters, and does the people just mean the upper classes, or does it include the plebs or not? No doubt, Roman society and Roman order was evolving during this period. The life of the Roman hero Camillus, as described by Plutarch, will describe the last era of this murky period in Roman history. After his life, we move more clearly toward the time of the Punic Wars and more detailed accounts of Roman events. His full name, his tria nomina, was Marcus Fortius Camillus. If he was a real person, he would have been born sometime after the mid-5th century BC. According to Plutarch, he was elected tribune at a time when the 6 tribunes held more power than the consuls did, being trusted more perhaps because there were 6 of them rather than just 2, and there being such a great fear of monarchical power among the people then. The story of Camillus begins then sometime around the year 400 BC with the siege of a city called Veii. Now, that may be properly pronounced in Latin Veii, but it is very common in English to simply call it Veii. This city lay to the north of Rome, and at the time, as I said before, Rome was still confined to a small space in west-central Italy, possessing a realm not much larger now than the present-day metropolis of Rome, and the Romans were still in constant conflict with their neighbors. But the meaning of constant warfare in the ancient world had a different meaning than it might now. As we saw in the stories of the Greeks and the Persians that we've already been through, it was typical for armies to campaign only for short periods of the year, usually during the summer when crops were growing and required less labor. In the fall, armies would usually disband and the troops would return home to harvest the crops, only to reassemble for war, if necessary, in the late spring after planting a new crop. The siege of Veii, however, required more dedication. The people of Veii were essentially Tuscans, probably descended from the ancient Etruscans. They possessed a society more ancient than that of Rome, and the wealth of ages helped them to easily endure a Roman siege. So the tribunes began to ask of the Roman soldiers to stay and besiege the enemy city year-round, building forts and raising mounds to oppress and hopefully to finally break the Veians. This was hard on the citizen soldiers of the young republic, and they grumbled about it, but they endured the sacrifices required. They were probably inspired by Camillus, who was elected tribune more than once during the war with Veii and had reduced some other enemy cities while the main army remained at the siege. But during the 10th year of the war, again elected as one of the tribunes, Camillus favored a plan to dig tunnels that led from the camp outside the city to points directly underneath Veii. Attacking the walls simultaneously while soldiers emerged suddenly from their secret tunnels inside the city, the Romans were finally victorious after 10 long years. This victory, though, was not uncomplicated. There was controversy about how the spoils were handled, how the soldiers behaved when they pillaged the conquered city, and Camillus was never without his detractors, even as a great part of some Roman society lauded the man. In a subsequent war with another neighboring city, Camillus accepted money from the citizens of the enemy town in exchange for peace, and he returned home with the army to Rome. This angered many soldiers who had hoped for another opportunity to loot a fallen city. Eventually, due to this and other conflicts with the people of Rome, Camillus was sent into exile. Leaving his wife and children behind, he removed himself from the city and sojourned among the neighboring lands of Tuscany and Latium. Now, sometime prior to all this, maybe during the late 5th century BC, the Gauls had expanded into Italy. Now, these Gauls were a Celtic peoples, Indo-European speakers like the Romans, but from a branch of that ancient migration that had spread into Western Europe rather than Southern Europe thousands of years before. Now, their former environs, the regions known today as France and Germany, were becoming overpopulated, and they were now pouring into northern Italy by the hundreds of thousands, their women and their children and their livestock and their wagons trailing behind them. By the time that the Romans were capturing Veii, the Gauls were conquering and settling all of northern Italy, even seizing control of former Tuscan areas along the Adriatic Sea. The Romans were asked to mediate peace talks in this war, but seeing that these talks were failing, the Roman diplomats organized nearby Tuscan forces for an attack on the Gauls. This attack, the Gauls defeated. But the Gallic leader, a man named Brennus, was enraged by the perfidy of the Roman diplomats who had come as ambassadors of peace, only to violate their neutrality by siding with the enemy. In the aftermath of the battle, he marched his army toward Rome. Now, we have a tendency to portray the Gauls as these classic barbarians in our heads. They're men dressed in animal skins, if they're dressed at all. They're swinging axes. They're setting fire to everything. But it's clear from their descriptions that these were men with just as much refinement as any other and just as much intelligence. They were not burning cities down and looting everything that they came across. They were, as does every major power in the world, using their strength, which in this case lay in their numbers and their ferocity, to better their position in the world, and thus have all great powers ever done, no matter how quote-unquote civilized they appear. Now, on their march to Rome, Brennus ordered his troops to leave all of Rome's neighbors untouched. "We are only at war with the Romans," he told these people, thus ensuring their neutrality in the coming conflict, if not actually garnering their assistance. The army that the Romans were able to muster to meet this sudden challenge was large, perhaps 40,000 men, according to Plutarch, but they were mostly untrained conscripts with no time to drill or prepare. The Gauls, arriving swiftly, swept them aside and entered the city. When the Gauls came to the Roman Forum, they found a strange sight. Here had gathered many elderly priests and senators, those who had decided they could not bear to abandon the city or to take refuge in the capital. The capital was the fortress on a hilltop at the center of the city, much like the Acropolis of Athens, where survivors might rally after a breach of the city walls. And here many inhabitants, including Camillus' family, had taken refuge. But these old men that the Gauls found, seated and dressed in their finest robes in the Forum, were completely silent and motionless. The Gauls, Plutarch tells us, thought that perhaps they were some exalted beings. One bold Gaul, though, approached an old senator and tugged at his beard. The enraged old man struck the soldier with his staff, and in response the Gaul stabbed him with his sword, killing him. Then the spirit of pillage finally took over, and the Gauls, after killing all the senior men in the Forum, began to ransack the entire city. They occupied the city for about 7 months, besieging the many survivors who had fled to the well-defended capital. Now, during this time, some survivors of the Roman army that had been destroyed in the field had been holed up in Veii. They sent a messenger to Camillus, asking him to organize a new army and retake Rome from the Gauls. Now, after he agreed, they sent a man by a secret path into Rome and into the capital area, where he told the remaining Romans of the plan. The remnant of the Senate also agreed. They declared Camillus dictator, sent the messenger back, and settled down to wait for their rescue. It is this 7-month period in which we hear of the now famous tale of those sacred geese on the temple grounds in the capital. These geese alerted the besieged survivors to an attempt by the Gauls to use that once secret path that was used by Camillus' messenger to infiltrate the capital and put the Roman holdouts to the death. But the invaders were only barely turned back. Finally, though, after 7 months, half-starved and weary, and not having heard any news of Camillus since they had elected him dictator, the Romans in the capital offered to buy their freedom from the Gauls. And the Gauls were only too willing to hear the offer because they had been suffering the effects of a hot summer in Rome, which even back then had already become a haven for malaria-ridden mosquitoes. The Gauls were acclimated to more northern mountainous climes, and they were already quite literally sick and tired of the lowlands of central Italy. Just as the Romans were measuring out the gold before Brennus, the leader of the Gauls, though, Camillus appeared at the head of a new army, composed of reorganized elements of the defeated army and many allies. He defeated and destroyed the Gauls, and then began to rebuild the Eternal City. Camillus would go on to be named both tribune and even dictator. several times in his life. The years after the sacking of Rome were as dramatic as any in the history of Rome. At this time, the conflict between the commons and the patricianers continued to heat up. If you pay attention to global politics, if you know anything about the political turmoil of the last few centuries, then you are familiar with the idea of land redistribution. Radical political movements will state that the best solution to inequality in agricultural societies is redistribution of the land. In more industrialized or commercial societies, the same kind of movement will demand a more direct redistribution of wealth itself. Already in ancient Rome, this economic solution to inequality had occurred to political leaders. As Camillus aged, there was a greater outcry to resolution for resolution to the ever-present inequality between patricians and plebs. And first, it was suggested that one of the two consuls elected every year should always be chosen from among the commoners. Second, there was also political impetus to declare it illegal that anyone should own more than 500 acres of land. Essentially, this would result in a sort of redistribution of the land to the less wealthy, basically by seizing it from the rich. Camillus was conflicted about such matters. He had always stood on the side of the patricians in earlier class conflicts, but now, so many years later, he had fought alongside so many men, so many plebs, who now clamored for some redress of this grave economic injustice that it was hard for him to take sides. In the end, more severe reforms were avoided, but it became customary for consuls to be elected, at least sometimes, from among the plebs, with commoners even being called to the dictatorship in times of need. The tribunes would also grow in number, as would their power. Their greatest stance against the patrician senate was to simply say veto, or beto, I forbid in Latin, against any senatorial decision. And this veto would, in the words of Will Durant, bring to a grinding halt all the machinery of the state until the tribunes were satisfied. Now, in the next episode, we will transition into the era of the Middle Roman Republic, a long and busy period of Roman history in which the Punic Wars reshape the atmosphere of the Mediterranean and restructure the Republic itself. Until next time, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.